Today we'll be talking about Icelandic magical staves, which in the 17th century there's a variety of grimoires out there, magical books, that contain sigils and signs that are designed to allow people to do various things, different kinds of spells. And so what we're going to talk about today is kind of some of the basic sigils that are out there in the grimoires, and then how to use them, and a technique for creating your own, kind of taking off of what's already in there.
Okay.
So Iceland is heathen until about 1000 AD, where a vote was taken at the Althing, and they decided to become Christian. So slowly and peacefully over the next few centuries, Iceland is Christianized, and the magic sort of remains in place through that Catholicization process. And so we know a good deal about the kinds of magic that were done, both pre-Christian and post-Christian. The primary magical systems in the ancient pre-Christian Iceland are Galdr and Seidr. Galdr is the kind of vocal, evocative sort of magic that you're usually used to talking about and hearing about when you think about that old high magic kind of stuff. The word itself is related to chanting or shouting, and so when you think about Galdr, you might think about incantation formulas that are sung, spoken, or chanted. Very commonly, this is what's associated with runic work. Seidr is related more to the trance work and the ecstatic practice. So we won't talk a whole lot about Seidr in this, because these staves primarily deal with the Galdr sort of work. In order to understand the Icelandic staves, you also have to understand runes. You have to have kind of a really basic understanding of them. And I have... You may already have one of these.
I have several of these.
Yes, they float about. But
it's always good to have an extra.
It is. So runes obviously are a writing system that dates back to the 2nd century BC-ish. The Elder Futhark prevails in Iceland until about 800 in the Common Era. And the Younger Futhark, also sometimes called the Viking runes, become more common and prevalent until about 1500. Each letter, each rune is a sound, a word, and an idea. So Feu, which is the first one, is the sound, the word Fe, which means cattle, and the idea of wealth. So when you think about runes, sound, word, idea. Runes themselves can be used in magic on their own, as you may very well be aware, but combining them with other runes, or magical incantation, or Galdr, that invocation sort of thing, is believed to have lent them a greater power. So when you're doing rune work, you can either just do runes, or you can combine them together. You can do this incantation sort of thing, or you can speak the sounds. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those pieces as well. There are a variety of magical books that are known to have existed from about 1500 to about 1750. And interestingly enough, these books sort of coincide with the Protestant Reformation within Iceland. And we believe that there were things written down, we know there were things written down prior to this that talked about spells, that talked about incantations, but what we're talking about specifically here are those kind of black book sort of things, the spell books, yes, the grimoires, that really, when you think about a magic book, these are the kinds of things we're talking about. They're primarily present in Iceland right around the Reformation, right around 1500, and a lot of that has to do with the way that magic and these grimoires sort of interact with Christianity, and they interact differently with Protestantism than they do with Catholicism. because of
Catholicism is basically correct.
it's because of the way that the two types of Christianity sort of deal with magic. But there are a couple of specifically named black books that are mentioned in the lore. Two of which I'm going to mention that are lost books, and then one, which is the Galadriel, which I'll mention, is still with us, and that's where a lot of these come from. But the first is the Red Leather Book, or the Rauðskinni. It was compiled by Bishop Nicholasson the Cruel, and it was said to contain the blackest of magic. It was written in runes with golden letters on red parchment, which is why it's called the Red Leather Book. Another book called Greyskini is the Grey Leather Book, and it was in two parts. There were also possibly two copies of it in two different areas of Iceland. But the first covered sort of lesser magic. It talked about wrestling magic, palmistry, things like that, and it was written in Latin letters. So anyone who could read Latin could read this book. It was also said that if you read the first part of the book, your soul could still be saved at the end of it. But if you read the second part, your soul could not.
You were gone.
The second part included a wide variety of black magical spells that were written in cipher runes. So they weren't even written in regular runes that anyone could read who read runes, but they were written more specifically in a cipher-style text. This is not at all uncommon for these black books. The third book that I'll talk about is the Galadriel, which is the still extant book that we have. It's in a universal letter. Galdrabok. It's a book of magic, essentially. It was compiled sometime around 1650 to 1750 by 4 different authors. It does not have a central narrative of any sort. It's really just a collection of spells. It's more like a cookbook than anything else.
And it's still with us.
Yep. We still have it. It's been translated a couple of times in English. And it's kind of nifty.
And the other ones are lost?
Lost. The Red Leather Book was said to be buried with the bishop. And I forget what happened to the Grey Leather Book. There was a guy who wanted to find the Red Leather Book. And so he summoned the spirit of the bishop, using, of course, necromancy, which is what one does to find these books, and went mad from the process. So
Yeah.
it's a good H.P. Lovecraft style story.
Right?
But in the Galadriel, to kind of give you an idea of the process of it being created, the first 10 spells or so were likely created in Iceland in the late 1500s by the first author. Spells 11 through 39 were probably created also in Iceland by a second author. Clearly a different person, but still in Iceland. Spells 40 to 44, well, at least part of 44, were probably written in Iceland by a third author who wrote in 17th century cursive. So, completely different writing style. The rest of spell 44 through 47 were written by a Danish magician in Denmark. And these spells probably came from other contemporaneous Icelandic magical texts that are no longer around. 25 of the spells in the book contain Icelandic magical staves. Some of them are just the staves, and some of them have prayers or incantations included with them as well. Pretty much all of these books, as I mentioned, are a product of their times, so they deal with the religious realities where they were created. A lot of the spells have appeals directly to Christian or Jewish figures, Greek or Gnostic figures, and several other non-Germanic figures. even while they call out to those ancient pagan gods at the same time. So they are ripe for the idea of repaganization sometimes. You can sort of guess at who the deities might be that you'd call on. A couple of them call out to both God and to Satan. It's just kind of an interesting mix of who they call out to.
Sounds like it.
So Icelandic magical staves, what are they? So the Icelandic word for these is stafir, which is S-T-A-F-I-R. And that's the plural. The singular is stafur with a U-R instead of an I-R. And most likely that name is inherited from the media on which they are created. Most of the time they are sticks or staves or some other sort of wooden object. So that's where they get the name. They don't all look straight and narrow, you know, there's nothing like that with them. They're all very different, but that is probably from the medium. The designs themselves are scratched or carved on, typically, is the word that's used, either risa or rista. Risa meaning scratched, rista meaning carved. And there are kind of three classifications of magical signs that you find in these ancient grimoires. There's the bondrunir, which are the bind runes, which you're probably familiar with. These are runes or magical signs that are made up of two or more runes in combination. So if you think about the Bluetooth symbol, it's a bind rune. The Galdrastafir, which are the magical staves, is the technical term, sometimes have runic elements, but they may not be entirely runic. Most of the time they seem to be based on runes but stylized off of them. So the Helm of Awe is an excellent example that, you know, looks like it's mostly runic. You can actually see the runes that were in it, but when you try and fully describe exactly, you know, what each piece of it is, you can't really necessarily say, oh, that's a rune, that's a rune, that's a rune. So there's some stylistic change that goes on. The Galdramandir are magical signs that have no specific runic element. So they don't come from the runic alphabet. And these are kind of like the characteres in Greek magic, which are, if you've ever seen a page from an old, like the Greek magic papyri or something like that, they're just covered in signs or symbols that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And we don't have any theory regarding how things like this developed in the north, but in the Mediterranean, the prevailing scholarly opinion on these things seems to be that the signs have no meaning to the uninitiated. Like someone who doesn't know what the mysteries are can't figure out what these are simply by looking at them. You can't stare at them like you can with a magical stave and say, oh, I see this rune and this rune. You just have to know what they are. And in the Mediterranean world, they're said to derive their power from being sort of a common language between magician and spirit. So the magician knows what they mean because he's initiated into these mysteries. The spirit knows what they mean because that's part of their language. And so the characteres can be used to communicate. And I suspect that the magical signs that are like this in Icelandic are very similar.
Would it be safe to presume that if you are a northern shaman and you know your magic and you know the runes and you know your particular individuals, are you going to take what you already know and make your own?
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Okay. And that's what I would have presumed a lot of that was, is that they've already taken it and gone well beyond.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
This is for the kindergartners, the rest of you are...
In a lot of ways, these magical signs that have no really rhyme or reason are about the secret language that the magician himself has created or developed with the spirits that he works with. And some of them are fairly common. There's a good Thor rune or sign that you see that it's not obviously derived from any runes, but it was very common in the ancient world. The Thor's hammer actually is another example of one of those kinds of signs. So if you know what it means, you can use it to communicate with Thor.
Right. Well, the triclef as well is one of those. It's an obvious sign, sigil, whatever you want to call it, meaning something. We just don't know to whom it's applied. Okay.
So those are kind of the three types of signs that you see. And then there are three substances that are typically associated with these signs. The first is certain woods and herbs are probably the most common things, or one of the most common things. And the woods that are mentioned are mostly oak, ash, rowan, alder, and yew.
Very Irish.
Well, very Indo-European.
Yeah.
Oak obviously is the sky thunder god kind of thing, but and the probably one of the more amusing things is that Iceland doesn't have a whole lot of trees in general.
Lots of mountains, no trees.
But in terms of herbs, leek is probably one of the more common that you find, and then there's something called Frigg's herb, which is an orchid of some sort, and Balder's brow, which is Thorson seems to think that is eyebright, is the herb that is associated there. Another substance that is very important is blood. You will find in the Havamal a statement about runes, know how to color them. And that is often read as a reference to the idea of coloring them with blood. And
it binds you to those.
Yeah,
it binds you to your oath.
There's there's plenty of examples in the lore where blood is used in coloring runes for various purposes.
They also use ochre too.
Yep.
Red ochre.
Yep. Our word for blessing comes from the Germanic word for blood. And so blood is kind of that central substance that hallows things. We're speaking here purely of the ancient world when I say that typically the blood is either the blood of the magician or the blood of an animal, but it seems to be that process of coloring that really sort of activates the rune or the sigil or whatever it is. Stones are actually pretty common as well as a substance. So you might think about little stones that are carved to aid in either healing or cursing. There's a whole set of healing stones that are mentioned, but it doesn't specifically usually say what kind of stone. So you can kind of take a stone and use it. There are a few things that are mentioned specifically in the lore, but in this case, the stone itself is typically carved with the sigil, which is what makes it special, not what kind of stone it is. So most of the sigils are created for they're created for just about any reason, but in the grimoires, specifically protection is the most common reason to carve these. Offensive spells comes in a good close second. The best defense is a good offense, I suppose. To bring the magician good fortune or luck is very common. Discovering thieves is also remarkably common. And when I read through that, I was thinking about other spells that are out there from other areas, and it seems that magicians have a lot of problem with thieves because everyone's trying to find out who stole stuff from them. And there's at least one for invisibility as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how the staves are created. Probably the easiest way to think about how people made them would be to look at how runes were dealt with, how they were sort of created in the process. And the runic formula itself is fairly simple. You carve the runes onto a piece of wood, a stone.
Whatever the medium is, because I have
Yeah.
a bone set.
Yep. Carving is fairly important. Getting into the thing. It's the idea of actually indenting or pushing into the surface so that there's some relief there. Some people today will paint them onto stones or things like that, which I suspect is probably fine for basic divination, but if you're going to be doing magic with them, I would recommend actually carving in, because the rune poem, or the Havamal, sorry, not the rune poem, is fairly specific on how to carve them. And then once they're carved in, the actual activation process starts with the coloring or the reddening. So you want to dye or stain the rune or staff with a coloring agent. In the ancient world, this was often blood, ochre, as you mentioned, or something kind of like that. Not all runes are red. When you see them out, if you've ever seen a colored rune stone, not every one of them is red. A lot of them are, but not every one of them. So you can use other colors as well, but
Yeah, mine are black.
yeah, the connection to blood for hallowing, I think, is what most people are looking for there. So a lot of people go with
The red.
with the red. And then calling. Calling is, I tend to think, one of the kind of the thing that seals the rune or the sign into place. Yes. And so if you chant the name of the rune while you carve it, then this charges or loads the runes with all that magical power. It's that Galder piece that we talked about earlier, where you sort of call that thing out from the mists. And a lot of modern magicians will also do a visualization portion with that as well, and actually see that rune coming out of the mists of magic in their mind, or see the thing that is associated with it. You might see if you're calling out Feu. As you do that, you see the cow come out of the mists in front of you. And that's a good way to do that, sort of seal it in your mind. So
As to what it means and what its magic is.
Yep. One of the things that you don't see a lot of in Northern magic is the idea of spirit intervention. So calling on a spirit or a god or a demon or something like that has to be involved in the process for runes or for the magical signs to work. So the idea in the northern climates seems to be that these signs are really powerful on their own. So you need to be careful with them, you need to understand them, and if you do something silly, like carve them onto a whalebone and stick them under your a girl's bed who you're trying to marry, you might just make her sick, as happened in Egil's saga, where he provided the very wise words, one who does not know runes should not carve them. So that's the basic process of actually creating the staves. If you want like a real basic, carve, color, and call. So we've talked a little bit about the grimoires, where all this stuff comes from. We talked a little bit about the runes. We talked a little bit about how the runes sort of interact magically. Now, the magical staves. So I want to talk about the most common magical signs first, and there are 3 of them in particular that I want to talk about. First is the Helm of Awe, which is by far the most common, and if you've never seen one, I'm sure both of you have. That's kind of what they look like. You'll see that it looks like either 4 or 8. This one has 8. Algi's runes radiating from that central point.
So the Wheel of the Year radiating out.
Yeah, you can look at it as that as well. The Helm of Awe is also known as the Helm of Terror, or the Tarnhelm, if you're into your Germanic opera. But the mythic legend that goes with it is the legend of Sigurður slaying the dragon Fafnir. And once he has done this feat, he comes across the dragon's hoard, and one of the things in the hoard is the Helm of Terror, or the Helm of Awe. And in this case, it's not really a helmet that you would think of when you think about a helm that you find in a dragon's hoard. It's more of a covering that you wear. There's an old silent movie version of the Nibelungian League where it looks more like a net.
Invisibility cloak.
Yep, kind of looks just like that. But instead of making you invisible, this inspires fear and awe in your opponents. There's a notion that perhaps this is related to, because it's found in a dragon's hoard, related to the idea of mesmerism that snakes were said to have, where they mesmerized their prey and paralyzed them with fear. But who knows if that's the case. It's just an interesting sidebar to go with it. But this is by far the most common of all the magical staves that you will find. And this particular one is good for just about everything. I mean, it puts fear in your enemies, it protects you. It's good for being in court, protecting your cattle or your wealth, all sorts of stuff. It can get you a girl if you wanted to. You know, it's there are very few sigils for getting a boy.
That's not fair.
See, though, we'll talk a little bit about that, because what I did when I found this to get a girl talisman, which I've got a copy of here, this one, I realized that it wasn't fair, so I made it get a boy talisman as well.
Too many people like the opposite.
Yeah. Another really common one is the sleep thorn. And the sleep thorn, I don't have one here. But
Sleep thorn?
Sleep thorn. And essentially, if you were to draw an Ingvaz rune and then an Isa rune on top of it, you'd have
The diamond?
Yep, the diamond and a line coming out the top of it. And that would be your most common representation of the sleep thorn.
So does the Isa dissect?
Nope.
It just comes out from the top point.
Yeah. And this one is said to put people into a deep sleep, from which they cannot awaken. There are there are a very wide variety of permutations of this particular staff, but that's probably the most common way of drawing it. And then this is the magical spell that Odin puts on Brunhilde. And when Sigurður rides through the flames to essentially claim her, that is what breaks the spell and allows her to wake up. So it's the bravery of the guy who slayed the dragon, stole Tarnhelm, riding through and waking her up. So very much Sleeping Beauty myth.
Yahoo! Love wins.
Yep. Let's see. I've only got one of these. But this is the Vejvashir, which is the signpost. And it's
Spell it.
Vegvisir. Signpost is just the easier way to write it. But the description that comes along with the stave is if this sign is carried, no one or one will never lose their way in storms or bad weather, even when the way is not known.
Yeah, I need that one. Sign is carried, you never lose your way.
Yep. Even if storms or bad weather or things intervene, you will still come through the storm unscathed and you will get to your destination. Of the common ones, those are probably the ones that I would say are the most common, are those three. And then a less common one, but one that is really nifty anyway, and I went through and I did this today.
This is it?
Yeah, that's the signpost.
Yeah.
Bashir, yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah, it's a little complicated.
I'm thinking.
But as you can see, it's actually a really good example of the kind of non-runic sort of sigil. It's clearly inspired by. You can kind of see the inspiration within the runes, but by that same token,
There are some here I don't know.
it's completely stylistically changed. So there's a lot of changes that went on with it. This one doesn't have a name in the lore, but it's to cause fear. And the spell itself says that if you want to cause your foe to be afraid of you, whenever he sees you, then carve these staves, which are there, onto an oak branch and wear it in the middle of your breast, and see that you see him before he sees you. And that will cause him to ever be in
Afraid
fear
of you?
Yes.
And it's called what?
It doesn't have a name itself. It's just the title of it is to cause fear. It was a really simple one that I could put together real fast today to show you kind of how quickly it works. And I mean, that's all the instruction that you get. Put it on an oak branch, wear it right here, and see them before they see you, and you're covered.
Interesting.
Yeah. So.
And it instills fear in them, huh?
Yep.
Looks like two Ises and Gabos.
Mm-hmm. It does. It's got a little curly Q on the end.
Mm-hmm. On one of them, anyway.
Yep. So, but that was the whole spell, was to do that. So some of these are really simple. So.
Yeah, these are really cool.
And obviously, if you wanted to activate that, the next thing to do would be to color it, and then to sort of name it and call it out.
Very cool.
So that's kind of a real high-level overview of four particular ones, the real common ones, and then one that's a lot less common, but that comes out of the Galadriel as well. Stephen Flowers, whose translation of the Galadriel is a key source for this. It is out of print now. You can find PDF copies of it online, but I think on Amazon the cheapest I've ever seen it was about $80, and it's a very small paperback book. So, but Stephen Flowers supposes that the staves, which often will have the same name, but they'll appear differently in different grimoires, depending on who's drawing them. And the reason for this seems to be that the magician is learning not the external sign, so they're not actually, learning exactly what each one is supposed to look like, but they're learning sort of an inner sign.
What it means to them.
Exactly. How it would manifest itself for them. So when you transliterate it onto paper, when you actually draw it out, it's going to look a little bit different than what maybe another magician draws.
Right.
In other words, the staves are about understanding on a deep level what the stave itself means. Not about learning someone else's form for drawing them.
Right.
So if your stuff looks a little bit different, that's not a bad thing necessarily. It's a good thing to start by understanding what other people have done, I think, as it is with anything. But don't worry if your stuff looks a bit different.
I never do.
So probably the most common way for a modern magician to try and do something like this, or to start out with something like this, would be to start with sigilization. If you're familiar with sigilization at all, or the creating of sigils in modern magic from Eosphere or something like that, most of the time what that involves is taking a statement of will, rearranging the letters, and turning that into a sign of some sort. That sort of obscures the meaning of the phrase, but is still...
So, all intact.
Yeah. The quick way, I guess, to do that for these is to do kind of the same thing, but replace the Latin letters that we're used to writing with runes, and you'll end up with a more runic-looking, Icelandic stave-looking sort of sign.
Well, wouldn't that be just considered a binder in there?
Yeah, typically, if you're gonna go that route, that's the easier thing to do is a binder rather than a stave. But then what you can do with this is you can take that binder and you can stylize it a little bit, and you'll end up with something that's more stave-like. The nice thing about working with runes instead of working with the Latin alphabet too is that you can actually use the runic meanings instead of the runic letters if you want to sort of provide a little bit more magical oomph. But again, take heed in what I said earlier, and remember that one should not carve runes who does not know them. Magic squares are another way to do it. If you've ever looked at the various magical squares that are just kind of like a square of letters, you can use those to sort of trace out
Never seen
a word.
them done in letters. I've seen the numerals.
Yep. You can do it numerically too. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to do them. The Sator, Arepo, Tenet squares are actually pretty common in these grimoires. So those are interesting things to look at and mess around with. I can show you one of those if you're not familiar with them.
I'm familiar with the Sato square. I'm just not sure what it's for.
A variety of things. It's kind of another sort of sigil in some ways, or another sign. I don't think anyone actually truly knows what they were for. I think that a lot of magicians just sort of copied them down. But they do appear all over the place in magical literature, all over the West.
Oh yeah, I've seen the Sator square a lot.
Yeah.
Just not sure, so I've never used it.
One of the other things, which is I think a little bit better than a magic square for these, are the Odin's eyes that we put together. And what these are, they've got the runes around the edge in circles. And what you can do with these is, say you want to sigilize the name of a spirit, or you want to create something that's that sort of pulls in certain runic energies. What you can do is you can, for instance, if you're using a name, you can start at the first letter in the name, and then you can draw around, and you'll get a sign based on going from letter to letter. Ian Corrigan's done a lot of this with, with his Court of Briege work and things like that. And then, because he was using the Fiche Fin, which is an Irish. It's actually the original version of this, but it's in the Book of Ogham, and it's got all the Ogham letters arranged in circles.
Book of Ogham?
Yep. And what we did was we took the idea of that and we applied it to the runes, and it turns out that it works in pretty nifty ways as well. So
I'm getting one of these today.
let's see. And then once you've done that, once you've figured out what your sign is that you're going to use, then you'll want to activate it. So carve it into wood. I would typically suggest a wood burner because they actually go into the wood and they color all at the same time, which is nice. Takes a little bit of learning to control, but it's a lot easier than using a knife.
The neat thing about using a knife is that if you slice your finger open, you've got the color right there.
Yep.
This is true. Speaking of which, next thing you'll do is redden or color the symbol. And then call out to the stave by speaking its name or some of the constituent parts. So if you've got a number of runes in there, you might call out the runes. But when you do that, think about it kind of as breathing life into the stave. And if you really want to go all crazy modern chaos magic on it, you can turn it into a servitor or whatever you want to do there. But those are kind of the basic steps to creating your own. Now, as you do a little bit more work, associating things with different types of wood or herbs or things like that are good as well. So those are also options. And just to show you a couple more of these that I've got floating around, I told you this is the Get a Girl talisman here. The Get a Boy talisman. These are all hand done ones. Of course, it's going to be one of the last ones.
Of course it is. It's always on the bottom.
That would be the Get a Boy talisman there. That's the Get a Girl hand done one. That we put together. This one is originally this was a whetstone thing to keep your tools sharp, but since most of us don't use whetstones these days, I've actually repurposed that sign, and I tend to use it as a sharpening the mind sort of sigil, because it essentially provides the same
idea.
function, and it works out very nicely, I think. There's that one. That's the sharpening the mind one. This one is a lesser circle of protection, which is kind of a complicated one, but a lovely one to look at. And then this one is for finding out a thief.
Thief of your heart, thief of your belongings.
Typically belongings in these cases. Most magicians, if they're looking to find out a thief of their heart, they already know who that is. And they do not nice things to those people, typically.
What is this one again?
That's the thief one.
Yep, that's to find out a thief.
Yikes.
Yeah.
That looks like thorn bushes.
This is a luck one, which is good and simple.
What was this one again?
That one is a lesser circle of protection.
Okay.
So that's
This
a
one's
protection
to sharpen
piece.
your mind.
Yeah, and these are all just kind of the simple ones. I didn't trot out any of the really particularly difficult ones because
Which
I didn't
one's
have
the
time to
circle?
She's got it.
Okay.
I've only got one copy of that right now.
Sorry, I'm drawing it.
That's okay. Take your time.
It's complicated. Do you have any questions about any of these, or how you make them, how you use them? The symbols are potent on their own, as I mentioned. So carrying them in your pocket is usually enough to get them to activate and to work. Particularly things like the Helm of Awe. Though sometimes it'll say draw it on your head or whatever. Hold it in your right hand when you meet someone that you want to marry or things like that. But for the most part, especially for kind of the more generic symbols, or the more common ones, I should say, not necessarily generic, but the ones that do a lot of things, those tend to be pieces that just by carrying them on yourself you can get a lot of benefit from. So. I also have floating around here the Necropants sigil, which is one of my personal favorites.
I've seen that.
It's a...
I don't know what that is. What does that mean?
Necropants is...
Necro means dead, is all I know.
Well, there's actually a pair of these in the Icelandic Museum of Witchcraft and Sorcery. And the Necropants are... it's a spell where you find someone who's a willing victim, and after they've died, you skin them from the waist down.
Thanks.
And then you step into their skin. You wear them as pants. It has to be a man, because what you do is you go to church on either Christmas Eve or Easter morning, I believe, and you steal a coin from an old widow at the service or after the service. And then you put the coin in the scrotum.
This is the thief.
That's the thief one, yes. You put the coin in the scrotum, and from then on, it will always be full of coins for you. Now, it also says that you have to find someone else who's willing to take over the pants before you die, because should you die in them, you will be damned. But you have to get someone who's willing to step into them as you step out of them in order to save your soul before you die.
Not be trying that one.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. These ancient spells are all terribly interesting. I love them a lot. I like to read them.
I'm thinking.
Because they're hilarious.
Wait.
Any questions?
I do, but I don't remember.
What would be a good website?
Wikipedia actually has a whole bunch of them listed, and you'll find them actually. There's not a lot of information, even in the grimoire. Most of them are 3 to 4 line descriptions of what the sigil does. So if you go out to Wikipedia, you're going to get almost as much information as you're going to get in the grimoire itself. And there have been a number of people who have taken the time and the great pain to actually go through and draw the sigils out for you, and so you can actually see what they look like. And that's kind of nice. So.
Yeah, that's what I was like. Because my drawing sucks.
The other place to go online is to look up the Galadriel PDF. I found it fairly quickly on Google. I've actually held a physical copy of the book in my hands, but you can't find it these days. Not for cheap, so. When it comes out, buy it, because sometimes they go back in print. That's my plan.
Put it on your wish list.
Yep.
Yeah. Are many of these, because some of these are, some of these you can see more ancient symbols in, not just runes. I'm talking like if you go back far enough, you can see what's it called? From India. Not Hindu. Further back than
Vedic?
that. No, further back.
Further back in Vedic in India?
Yes.
Dravidian?
Begins with an S.
Sanskrit?
There you go.
Okay, Sanskrit is the language for Vedic
Okay.
India.
All right. Then some of these I see that in. So my question then becomes is everyone has talked about the East or the Middle East being the culture of knowledge and it just spreading out from there. could it have been very likely that not only did it spread this way, but it spread down into Egypt and Mesopotamia area, and
magic spreads in particular this type of magic, this grimoire, this idea of a magical book where you've written stuff down, is not at all uncommon in the ancient world. You
Right.
find it all over the place.
right.
And there's clearly influences from the Mediterranean in these grimoires in the far north. The Cedar Square, for instance, the idea of palindromes being important. There's a definite tradition of foreign texts being important for magicians, because one of the things that magicians like to think is that if it's foreign, it must be powerful. So you find a lot of Jewish stuff
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of this northern thing, because in the conception of of ancient magicians for sure, and even more modern magicians, you think about the life of Moses, and Moses is clearly a very powerful magician. I mean, he's turning rods into snakes, and yeah. I mean, it's he does all sorts of stuff that your ancient magician would find really cool.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of stuff calling on
Ancient
Jewish
powers.
deities and angels and things like that. And if you look at the Greek magical papyri, they're calling on what scholars now call barbaric names, which appear to be nonsense words.
Right.
And there was this idea in the ancient world that you shouldn't wander around muttering syllables, random syllables out, because if you do, you're going to end up calling on something that you probably don't want to call on.
Right.
And that's because we don't know all the languages, and these things are out there, and they might be,
Yes.
they might show up, and that's not a good thing necessarily. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not at all uncommon for magicians to steal from foreign places, because foreigners are really good at magic, and they're usually better at it than we are. And that, who we is depends on where you are, and who foreigners are depends on where you are. But it's not at all uncommon, especially in Western magical traditions, to steal from as many people as possible.
Oh yeah.
But then there comes the threat and the be careful what you get.
Well, yeah.
Because, just because you don't, I mean, that's like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's actually for the living. The Book of Life is the one that's about how to, necromancy,
Mhm.
how to bring back the dead. And I'm like, ooh.
Yep.
That,
Necromancy is not at all uncommon in the ancient world. Everyone wants to bring back the dead for some reason.
yeah.
Because everybody wants to know where the gold's buried at.
Yep, that is the most common reason.
But you know what? In ancient times, gold wasn't even a source of income. I mean, it's only been in recent history that gold is a viable source. Back then, it was stones that were
Silver
from
was
the
pretty
earth,
valuable.
silver, and because they didn't know gold existed.
Right.
Well, they knew gold existed.
There wasn't much of it made though.
No,
So they
it's
must
harder
not have
to
been able
find.
to find a lot of it.
It's mentioned in the Bible: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So,
Well, the Bible isn't that old.
that's true.
Compared to everything else, the Bible's not that old.
So, yeah. Any other questions?
Mm-mm.
No.
Sweet. Thank you guys for coming out.